everybody, it's Drybear. Over the last month, we've been covering the Krafton v Unknown Worlds and Subnautica 2 drama. There's been a lot of back and forth and some pretty shocking revelations that we've gone over. And it's been a really rocky road too, where we thought we were going to get Subnautica 2 this summer. That didn't happen. And then all of a sudden, the original founders of Unknown Worlds, the people that started Subnautica and the games that they worked on after that as well, were forcibly ejected and fired from the company. And then a new CEO was put in place over it. And there's been this tons of just very nasty stuff going back and forth. The community's been panicking. And then, a couple weeks ago, we covered the lawsuit that the founders had filed against Krafton for breach of contract. That was the official violation that they were going after. We talked about that a little bit. However, the challenge with their original lawsuit that they're bringing to the court in Delaware is that it was very much an emotional appeal in a lot of ways. Now, it doesn't mean that they're wrong in their stance, but it definitely felt like it didn't have the same kind of financial backing that we're going to see here today. And that is because starting today, very late last night, so, less than 24 hours ago, Krafton put out an official response to the court towards the founders on their claim that they broke contract. So today I'm going to do my best to review their response to that and just kind of see where Krafton sits on that front. Keep in mind, Krafton obviously has more corporation level funds, and probably they have their own legal team on staff as well. So it's probably going to be a little bit more coherent and a little bit less emotional appeal that we saw from the individual lawsuit that we saw from Ted, Max, and Gil and the push there for him. But I encourage you to kind of keep an open mind when it comes to this. Obviously, I am not a lawyer. I don't, I can't I'm not qualified to discern some of these legal aspects, but we'll look at some of the revelations that come from this because they talk a lot about their initial purchase agreement and what comes from it. I know the community in general is on the side of the founders, and I think rightly so in general. Most people don't like large corporations, especially since, it seems like the founders were kind of doing what they were always doing before with Subnautica, going into early access, and then the fight back from Krafton, their publishers that had purchased them, said that early access wasn't complete enough, and it just kind of seemed like Krafton was stalling the works to try and prevent the early access from going out, and they were claiming that there was going to be irreparable damage done to the Subnautica brand with Subnautica 2 coming out with what Krafton believes is undercooked. And a lot of the community thinks that, that's kind of what early access is for. So let's dive into the response, the legal response that's been filed with the courts today from Krafton. And again, keep an open mind as we kind of get more and more facts on this case. It seems like there's definitely wrongdoing on both sides. You could say that Krafton overstepped their bounds and kind of, blocked a release of Subnautica 2 early access that could have been great. We would be playing Subnautica 2 early access right freaking now if it wasn't for Krafton and their blocking of the release and their firing of the founders, but we don't really know exactly what state it was in before it went out. So let's dive into what Krafton has to say, at least from their perspective. So they start, and this is their response in the official court. This is the actual response that they filed with the court here. So keep in mind, again, when it comes to court battles in general, your opponent is not going to sing your praises. So oftentimes it gets a little bit elevated and they kind of be a little bit more puffed up in that sense. We've kind of heard from the founders, and this is what Krafton has to say. Whether it's true or not, we'll have to wait and see. But they are alleging that rather than investing the effort necessary to meet the earnout conditions freely negotiated, they instead have resorted to litigation to demand a multi-million-dollar payout they haven't earned. And this is pretty charged language from that standpoint, so we kind of have to pay attention to that. Worse, they now ask the court to reinstate them. And this is the part that I think stands out for me. I think, deciding whether there's wrongdoing or not is one thing in the court, but obviously the founders have stated in their lawsuit that because Krafton breached contract, they now have to reinstate with back pay and their earnout for all three of the founders, which I think is asking a lot. Obviously, maybe you want to ask for the moon and then you settle on a satellite somewhere in between. But they are kind of reaching pretty far for that, asking to be reinstated and given their roles there. So, however, This is a pretty intense statement. To roles and positions they had abandoned years before ever filing this action. So Krafton believes that the founders abandoned their roles and tasks and were providing no value to the progress of Subnautica 2. Another interesting aspect is they say here Krafton paid $500 million in exchange for 100% of Unknown Worlds outstanding shares. Now, as far as equity goes in Unknown Worlds after the purchase from Krafton, I haven't seen anything official that I trust that shows where the equity was in the company. Now, generally when companies are smaller, sometimes when there's M&As or like there's some kind of acquisition or something, or there's change of control, they might institute new equity and then dilute the equity, like the shares that the existing owners have. We don't really know exactly how much of the company was owned, like shares wise, like equity wise, from the founders versus other employees versus Krafton, how that works. But at least in this, they say that they paid to get 100% of Unknown Worlds outstanding shares, which means any of the shares that weren't doled out, that weren't already like belonged to somebody, Krafton got all of them. That could be a small amount, that could be a large amount, and I'm guessing Krafton probably wanted majority control, which means they probably got a large number, or they instituted new equity to dilute what was already there for that. Then they go on to talk about the payout, and this is probably the biggest part that has been kind of shown. There was supposed to be a $250 million payout for Subnautica 2 launch, and this is where a lot of the drama came from, right? Like if the payout was meant to be fit, if Krafton blocks the launch of Subnautica 2, obviously they can't hit the revenue targets without releasing Subnautica 2 in early access, which means that if they don't hit the revenue targets, Krafton doesn't have to pay the $250 million. And this is where a lot of the drama came from. Like, why is this big corporation, this big publisher, this multi-billion-dollar company blocking the release of a game just so they don't have to pay out their employees for the money that they're already earned? So in this, they say that Krafton gave key employees the opportunity to pocket an additional earnout of up to $250 million. We already knew this. If in the upcoming 4 years, they were purchased in 2021 or in 2025, so 4 years ago, they were basically told that they had a stipulation that if they could lead the successful development of Subnautica 2 and other games and hit an ambitious revenue target in 4 consecutive quarters before June 2026. So this kind of gives credence to the fact that a lot of people were saying, the speculation was at least that there was a $250 million payout, and then part of that stipulation was they had to hit a revenue target, and Subnautica 2 would help them hit that target so it would pay out. So it sounds like they're almost like agreeing and confirming what the founders are alleging here by saying that the payout was supposed to be given if they hit the revenue targets, and if Krafton blocks the release of Subnautica 2, that is in opposition of them being able to reach that revenue target. And they go on to say that Subnautica 2 was planned for the first quarter of 2024 and was, postponed. And then obviously we saw those documents circulating about how Krafton had done an internal review of Subnautica 2 and said that it wasn't complete enough, it needed more content in it. And again, that kind of feels weird because early access is obviously meant to be a proof of concept. Subnautica has always gone into early access very early, and the development has been very long after that. In fact, the example I like to give is Subnautica Below Zero, the prequel / second game update was drastically changed. Like, they retconned the entire story, the main character, like everything was changed in early access for Below Zero, and a lot changed in Subnautica 1 as well. Now, the Krafton lawyers also say that the parties agreed that the employees would retain operational control of the company. Now, this is what we heard from the founders before, and this actually, I wonder if it's because Krafton has more lawyers on staff, but it seems like they're being a little bit more like fair about the facts here, because they are stating things in this that implicate Krafton as being the bad guy here as part of their own response statement, which I think is a little bit smarter than the way that the founders approached their initial lawsuit. And I'm not trying to place blame or anything here, but I did feel like after reading through the founders' lawsuit that it was a little bit more emotionally charged and a little bit less focused on the facts. It's more just like, these guys are bullying us and we're perfect and awesome. That's kind of how I felt after reading that, whereas this one feels a little bit more balanced regardless of who's responsible or not. But we start with them saying that the key employees will retain operational control of the company during the earnout period. So the key employees, and particularly Cleveland and McGuire, the original creators of the game, could develop the Subnautica 2 subject to certain conditions. These conditions, memorialized in the purchase agreement itself, were designed to protect Krafton's extraordinary investment in the key employees and keep them at Unknown World's helm. So it sounds like Krafton is actually giving credence to the fact that the founders were a big part of that equation, and they were trying to get them involved in that, and that they were going to retain operational control. But an interesting point here is to say during the earn-out period. So it could have been that the earn-out period was coming to a close, which means that operational control by the purchase agreement was lifted and granted back to Krafton as part of that, which then would create a really weird, awkward situation where, like, if Subnautica 2 hadn't been released and now operational control is changing, now Krafton wants to make a bunch of changes, but the game's not even out yet, and we don't really know what the state of it is, so things get kind of weird. Next, they say the plan unraveled. They sold the company, and they say that Cleveland and McGuire each pocketed an individual amount of $200 million apiece, and Gil, who received $60 million, quickly lost interest in developing Subnautica 2. And I think this is probably going to be a very important note in this lawsuit in general, is how active the three founders were in the development of Subnautica 2 related to the purchase agreement and the requirements of that acquisition that they were trying to accomplish. But obviously for $500 million, Krafton is saying that the majority of that $500 million went solely to the founders, which is not too atypical considering they're the ones that owned it. And obviously, if they held the majority of the equity in the company, it would all go to them. But if they bought it for $500 million, and then Cleveland got $200 million, McGuire got $200 million, and Gil got $60 million, that's $460 million going to three people, and then $40 million going to something else, potentially the employees, or even going into a war chest that allows them to continue operating and paying their operating costs for future. But Krafton claims that the founders abandoned their roles as studio-wide game director and technical director to focus on their personal passion projects and quit making games for Unknown Worlds entirely. And this is where things get a little bit more targeted towards the meat and potatoes of the lawsuit, because there is evidence that the founders went off to work on personal projects. We know like Cleveland was moved away from, he moved his primary residence away from the main studio of Unknown Worlds and started working on a movie. There's evidence they were moving around. Now, it doesn't mean that they weren't involved, right? Like that, I don't think that's enough evidence to say that they were slacking off and not being involved in it, especially since, if you are someone who is at a C-suite level, you often the C-suite is not involved in the day-to-day, like checking in change lists and checking content updates and packages and doing playtests every day. But you would probably argue that if you are someone who's invested in the development of the game, like even if I was like a VP or a C-suite or, like a GM, I've been a GM before, I was still doing daily playtests. I was still showing up for meetings. I was still very actively involved in the game, even though I wasn't, like sitting down and checking things into the version control. I was still meeting with leads and talking about the game and figuring out where we're going and looking at targets, showing up for daily playtests, seeing how the game is progressing, talking to QA and see where the bugs are and our stability and all of that. So you would argue that, if they are heavily invested in the game, that they would be involved in the day-to-day, even though they're not responsible for the actions of the day-to-day, they should still be aware of it and still be part of that process so that they can still kind of be instilled on it. And they say that Gil focused on leveraging his operational control to maximize the earn-out payment, which I'm definitely going to need some more detail on that because that's a pretty bold claim. They also say that the development director at Unknown Worlds told Gil that folks think Max and Charlie are checked out as studio heads and are confused as to why. And this is where a lot of people kind of found out that Charlie had moved to a different city and started working on a movie. So they claim that Cleveland had abandoned video games to pursue filmmaking entirely, like he just wasn't involved at all, a process he documented publicly on his website, which is actually true. You can see him like making comments about the movie he's working on and the fact that he moved away from the head studio headquarters and all of that. So that is there. Now, again, it doesn't mean that he wasn't involved in the development anymore, but it is something something that is kind of a knock against him of like, okay, why did you move away from the headquarters of the development studio, and why are you only posting about the movie? But, you know, again, social media is separate from your work life. It's very possible for someone to work on two things at once, that sort of thing. And they give a little bit of a timeline here where they planned for Subnautica 2 to be Q1 of 2024. Then it slipped to December, so Q4 of 2024. Then we know that Ultimate slipped to some redacted month. I think this is probably June or July for this. It could also be August, but I think they were targeting summer for their initial release, and then that was pushed back as well. But we know that Krafton was the one that pushed this back. We don't know exactly who pushed back from Q1 in 2024 to Q4 and then back to 2025. This happens all the time where you feel like the game's just not ready to go out into early access or not ready to release, and so you kind of keep working on it and moving that deadline out. And this is also going to be a key point as well. Krafton alleges that the key employees reduced the scope of the game, and this is kind of part of the internal review that we got from Krafton that they had published to kind of show that, like, hey, the game's not ready. And this is kind of where things kind of get a little bit more conjecture based, because obviously no game goes into early access fully complete and 1.0 release version generally, especially Unknown Worlds, which has a track history of going into early access with a very incomplete game that they definitely plan to change quite a lot about going into it. And honestly, I don't think any Subnautica fans were expecting a fully done game that had all the content in the world, right? Generally with games like this, you go into early access to try out the base mechanics, the core gameplay loop, the exploration. Subnautica 2 has multiplayer, which Subnautica 1 and Below Zero did not. And so you have those options there to kind of give you a different scope of it. So, you know, I don't like this argument from Krafton. I'm definitely on the side of the fanders here that, you know, I as a Subnautica fan, I wouldn't care if there wasn't enough biomes or wasn't enough monsters. I would have liked to try the building and try exploring and see what it's all about. And then you can follow along with the development as they release more updates after that. But Krafton alleges that it wasn't enough content even for early access, which is kind of hard to tell from the outside. The Krafton CEO then, after an internal review, which we saw the notes for, informed the key employees that a premature early access release of a highly anticipated sequel like Subnautica could cause irreversible harm to the entire IP, pointing out the sequel of Kerbal Space Program. I hate the fact, or maybe it's good, I don't know, like KSP was a very similar situation, and I think a lot of people love KSP in general, and the fact that we didn't get it is a huge issue for that. And I don't know, I feel like it's not a great example in general for Krafton. I think this actually makes Krafton look crappy using KSP as an example for that. But in general, yeah, I mean, obviously coming into an early access that's really terrible, that hurts it. But again, without knowing what it was, maybe Krafton's right here that it was too undercooked and it was just like a big bug-filled mess with no content. Or maybe they're not. Maybe it was perfectly fine for early access and it wouldn't have done any damage to the brand at all. The CEO even suggests that only about 12% of the intended 1.0 scope was available for the early access slated for summer this year. To be honest with you, it's hard, like if you're talking about content level scope, like monsters, biomes, things to collect, that sort of thing, 12%, when you put it as a percentage, does feel kind of small, but also like that could fill up very quickly. But let me know what you think about this one. You know, would you have been happy? Like, let's say if we take this from an objective perspective, if Subnautica 2 was only 12% done from its 1.0 release scope, would that have been a problem for you? If it only had like one biome, like the initial area near the Aurora or something like that from Subnautica 1, just like a single biome with crafting, multiplayer, and you can collect things and run around, and then they just put out a roadmap and said, here's our roadmap to 1.0. We're going to be adding this biome once a quarter, or like monsters that, like, would that have been a problem for you? Do we really feel like 12% is below the bar? And where does that bar sit for you, you know, personally, from that perspective? Then Krafton says that the founders got very nervous and forced out the game so that they could get continuous revenue to maximize their earnout. So the founders are saying, hey, it's ready for early access. People want to play it. We're happy with the starting point. We're going to get it out, start getting feedback, get the community involved like we always have, and we're going to get them as part of that process, and then we're going to start moving forward and doing roadmaps and early access. But Krafton says that it wasn't ready, it wasn't far enough along, even for early access, and the founders were being greedy and trying to shove the game out the door so they could get revenue from the sales so that they could reach their maximum earnout to make more money. So this is like, you have to kind of decide what side of the line you're on here. Whether, you know, this is actually a problem or not, or if they were just like, were the founders doing what they always did with early Subnautica games, or was Krafton in the right? I don't know. This one's a little juicy as well. Krafton had asked the two like studio head directors, the founders, to come back to their job. However, Krafton says that Gil stated that there's no coming back to a job they didn't have, and that Cleveland himself explained, we knew long ago that we cannot have this company live or die by its founders alone. And furthermore, companies often are limited by their founders. The company, in order for it to succeed, needs to bring new talent in, train those people and cover your weaknesses, and get better over time. This is how we started Subnautica 2. We knew from the beginning, all of us knew I wasn't going to be running that team, and I wanted to hire someone bigger and better for me than the sequel, which honestly sounds kind of reasonable. I mean, Cleveland specifically has been, you know, making mods and games for the better part of 2 decades, right? Like, he's been around for a long time, and, you know, relying on him forever, especially when you have younger people that might know the gaming space better, or know what gamers want, or know mechanics well, or even just has the youthful energy to force forward. Like, honestly, this sounds quite reasonable that, you know, forcing like the founders to be boots on the ground forever, I think is at least a reasonable approach, but it doesn't mean it's the only approach. Like, you could be doing, handing off the day-to-day to younger folks that, you know, are hungrier and want to work harder for that, and then they are just kind of there to make higher level decisions, as you'd expect from C-suite level employees. Krafton even says that the key employees secretly downloaded massive amounts of confidential information from unknown worlds in further violations of the EPA. So that's kind of like out of left field of saying, hey, they were stealing files and stealing information, which we had this whole situation with like Dark and Darker, the fact that they kind of left the company and then started a similar game. And then there was a big question of like how much of that similar game was just copied from content and code that was used to make that game and the company that they left. And if they're downloading files, are they going to make a new company and try to make a Subnautica-like with a different name that doesn't belong to them? So there could be some legal implications there. They even say that there was a unnamed employee at Unknown Worlds that had gone on record to say that Gil will concoct a scheme to get us that earnout. So Krafton's double downing on this concept that all the founders were doing for Subnautica 2 were just trying to make, you know, their own personal money and get out, that they had no investment in the game in general. That's Krafton's stance. It's also worth stating that defendant Krafton denies all allegations in the complaint, including all and any allegations in section headings and footnotes. So Krafton is saying unequivocally that everything the founders are stating is false and that they didn't breach any contract. But honestly, like, having gone over this over the last month or so, it seems like there was clear and demonstrable wrongdoing on both sides. It doesn't sound like either party was entirely innocent. So it's kind of bold of them to say that they had no wrongdoing in this whatsoever. Then Krafton just kind of goes line by line through their response here, like basically refuting or admitting to claims in the original one. And most of them are all denies. However, for this one, the founders had put forth, given its importance to the original success, the company planned to release Subnautica 2 into early access as well. The launch was slated to happen in blank of this year, summer sometime, and the fans were waiting eagerly. And Krafton says they admit that the allegations of the first and second sentences of paragraph 4. So they definitely say that, yes, they needed to be in early access. However, Krafton denies the allegations of the 4th sentence of this, which reads, almost 2.5 million of them had wishlisted the game on Steam, leading the computer gaming platform, making it the second most anticipated PC title in the entire world. So Krafton is denying that Subnautica 2 was one of the most wishlisted games in the world, except, I mean, you could probably make an argument that maybe if you include other platforms besides Steam, that isn't true, but is very obvious that Subnautica 2 was one of the most wishlisted games in the world, and actually still is. Krafton lacks knowledge or information sufficient to form a belief as to the motivations of those users, and therefore denies the remaining allegations of the third sentence of paragraph 4. They also deny that they were, bullying them. So like the founders say that they were being bullied into doing what Krafton wanted, and Krafton says it wasn't bullying, because of course they would say that. Who would say that about themselves in general? They also state that in this in general, which is kind of an interesting one, and maybe I'm just not qualified to decipher this, but they say that so the founders say in flagrant disregard of the parties' contract, Krafton terminated without cause 3 former owners of Unknown Worlds, Charlie, Max, and Ted, and seized control of the company. But then Krafton responds and says that defendant denies allegations and avers, which is like states in the third person, that Unknown Worlds terminated the 3 key employees, not Krafton, which is the first I've ever heard of this. I mean, from every angle that we've looked at, it doesn't sound like Unknown Worlds is the one that ejected their own founders. It sounds like Krafton was the one that did that. So it's kind of weird that they say that on July 1st they were ejected, and they state that Unknown Worlds was the one that did it. Krafton didn't eject them. But maybe I'm just too dense to decipher this. Let me know what you think about the text that's shown on screen. Kind of an interesting statement here. They've been kind of just like be a little bit more passive on this, which I think is just like lawyer approach to make sure they're not overreaching or overstepping, which can hurt them in the future. And I think that's one thing that I wish that the founders had done in their original lawsuit, not trying to overreach or be too bold in their lawsuit, because a lot of times that can end up muddying the waters and make it harder to get to the resolution you're looking for if there's too many bold claims in your lawsuit. But another one that's kind of interesting here is the founders allege that defendant Krafton is a South Korean video game publisher and holding company who purchased Unknown Worlds, but then Krafton kicks back and says, no, actually Krafton is a game developer, which is true. They do develop games and publish games as well. This is another part where it gets kind of weird too, because all these like backstory histories about like natural selection and like the moon project that they had worked on and all the things that don't relate to the case. Well, I shouldn't say that. They don't relate to Subnautica 2 and the interaction between Unknown Worlds and Krafton, but a lot of this is them responding saying that, hey, Krafton lacks knowledge and information sufficient to form an opinion. They don't comment on natural selection. They don't comment on their projects. They basically just kind of pick apart the lawsuit and say, hey, we don't know about these past projects. We don't know why it's in the lawsuit. We don't know why you're talking about natural selection in general. And we are not going to comment on that in general, except the fact that they acknowledge certain facts about the history of the founders and Unknown Worlds in general before Krafton got involved. And as we're getting deeper and deeper into this response, a lot of this has been in the lawsuit, right? If you read the original one from the founders, they talked about their whole history as Unknown Worlds, how they had to smash it with Subnautica, which is true. They talked about natural selection, other projects, yada, yada, which is kind of hard for Krafton to comment on because it doesn't really relate to them in any major way. So they just kind of admit that. However, we finally made it down here, paragraph 38, as we're all the way down towards the midway section. They mention an interesting topic here, right? So the founders are saying that Subnautica is the perfect example, the perfect early access example as entertainment, science, and culture publication. From day one, the Subnautica team has aimed for transparency, and they've opened up their development process to the public. So they're saying that it's like a deep-seated passion for gaming. They want to include the community, which is what Unknown Worlds has always done with their Subnautica games, something that's pretty rare. But what's interesting is the way Krafton kind of comes back at this one. They say they don't know, they don't have the information or knowledge to comment on the belief of like the authenticity or the quoted material. However, they denied allocations, and by way of further response, Krafton avers that the founders' early access method is a business method of selling unfinished games for a fee. So even though incomplete, they can quickly generate sales. So it's very strange that Krafton kind of has this perspective and states it in plain text in this response, saying that obviously Krafton has a predisposition to say that early access is a business method of selling unfinished games for a fee. So even though the game is incomplete, they can quickly generate sales, which isn't entirely untrue. A lot of times, games get, a certain percentage of the way there, the developer runs out of funds, and so they push it out in early access and say, hey, we're working on it, we're trying to finish, help us fund the rest of the development. And that's kind of where early access started out. Obviously, some, less than savory companies use this as an opportunity to make money when the game should have been further along and they had the opportunity to do so. But this colors a little bit of the lens that Krafton uses to view the process that Unknown Worlds has been utilizing. And Krafton also states that they warned the founders that they have to be careful with early access because it is the expectations of fans and common sense in the industry that sequels of hugely successful games such as Subnautica 2 must have creativity and novelty far beyond the original game. So this whole section of Krafton's response tells us a lot about where their mindset was. So they're saying that they believe that early access is a way to kick out unfinished games to make money, and they believe that sequels of highly anticipated games should be insanely improved upon over the original product. So maybe Krafton was looking at it saying Subnautica 2 is not far beyond the creativity and novel of the original game, and so it's not complete, and they're just kicking it out to make money to go for that payout, which honestly kind of puts it in favor of the founders, at least in my mind. Let me know what you think there. But if that is their expectation, it sounds like Unknown Worlds was just doing business as usual on how they do early access, but Krafton wanted them to step their game up and do more, like make Subnautica 2 2 times better than Subnautica 1 and make sure you're making it really, really creative and novel over the original, which it sounds like they were just doing Subnautica again, just the same process they've always done. Here's another one further down into their response as well. This was kind of a big turning point for them as well. So they, like, the founders had alleged that Unknown Worlds would remain an independent studio unequivocally, and Krafton, I mean, they don't have the whole EPA fully published, so we don't know exactly what it is, but Krafton is stating that it agreed to permit the founders to retain operational control because Krafton expected and trusted the key employees to dedicate themselves into developing the company's IP, Subnautica, creating a mutually beneficial outcome for all parties. However, reality was a complete betrayal of Krafton's trust. So this is a little bit more targeted to the topic of the lawsuit here of, well, was that in writing or not, right? So if it was in writing in the EPA that the founders would retain operational control over the company, and then Krafton comes in and says, you can't ship this game because we said so, then that would be breach of contract, right? And so the founders would be 100% in their rights to say, hey, you said we would have operational control, and you're trying to control the company, which is against the contract. But Krafton is stating here, at least in this, they're stating that they would only retain operational control because Krafton expected and trusted that they would do their job diligently and in good faith. But if that was like an unofficial expectation, it sounds like the founders are in the right here that they did violate that and then Krafton didn't set up. However, it could also be on the flip side that maybe it was stated in the purchase agreement that there was a requirement for them, they would retain operational control if they faithfully fulfilled their duties. And if Krafton can prove that they weren't faithfully completing their duties, that they were in the right to eject them from the company. Although Krafton's also saying that they didn't fire them, that Unknown Worlds fired them, which might have just been kind of like a sleight of hand thing where they made someone at the company do it for them so that they could have plausible deniability, that sort of thing. And further along into their response, Krafton admits that Cleveland stepped away from the company's most important project, Subnautica 2, and he has devoted more time to his personal projects. As a result, Subnautica 2 has continued to be pushed back from deadlines originally promised by the key employees, and the volume of content included in early access version has continued to decrease. So this is Krafton's main argument. It's going to be interesting to see if they could prove that, Charlie moving away and working on a movie was actually detrimental to Subnautica 2 or not, or was he just, fulfilling his duties and had extra time to spare? That's going to be a big part of this lawsuit, I think. Krafton also says that all of the delays, except for the final delay, were 100% on Unknown Worlds. So I hadn't actually heard anything official about this. Let me know if you have. But Krafton says that Unknown Worlds moved the planned early access release date to the fourth quarter of 2024. So from quarter 1, 2024 to quarter 4, 2024, that Unknown Worlds made that decision of their own fruition, that Krafton was not involved. And then they say that Unknown Worlds also made the other decision to move from quarter 4 of 2024 to the second half of, towards the end of the first half of 2025. So Krafton is saying that all of the delays were 100% Unknown Worlds. They weren't involved. They only got involved recently this summer when they felt like the early access was not there. You could also make an argument that if Unknown Worlds was the only one driving that operational control, if Krafton had some vested interest in how they wanted things done, why weren't they involved in those delays? Kind of, like shaking wiping their hands of this kind of thing, of like, hey, we weren't involved in the delays. Unknown Worlds did that, but then right before they wanted to release, then we got involved, kind of thing. Krafton also directly states that Cleveland's title changed to franchise creative director, and that he moved to Los Angeles to network with Hollywood creatives. Defendant denies the remaining allegations of paragraph 72, which is up here for the expansion here. So they do directly admit that, the move for Cleveland and the title change was something that did impact their decision making. So we can stop there for that. It's a pretty long document, but it kind of highlights a little bit of the perspective of Krafton. And I know this is kind of dragging on, but I'm curious what you think about this. Where do you stand? Are you on the side of the founders? Are you on the side of Krafton? Or are you on the side of, I don't care, just give me Subnautica 2 and make it good, whatever it is you have to do? Or maybe you're somewhere in between. Let me know in the comments down below. And I did my best to try and read this. Again, I'm not a lawyer, but I tried. So let me know what you think about this down below in the comments. If you found value in today's video, leave a like down below, leave a comment for the algorithm to help this video get seen by more people. And don't forget to check out my other channels for other content and other stuff and other things.